All right, well, welcome everyone to the City Council Economic Development Committee meeting for Wednesday, July 1, 2026. Call the meeting to order. Let the record reflect that Josh Moe, Councilor Oliver Weiland are present. Councilor Salah, we hope she joins us, however, would be joining us via Zoom. The second item on the agenda is to consider the minutes of the April 1 meeting. Any comments or questions on that, Councilor Weiland?
I move to accept correspondence.
I think I have to second.
Yeah.
So, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Same sign. All right. Item 3. We are under reviewing the proposed governance and distribution policy for the Arts Endowment Fund, and I think that's Rachel, right?
Yes, I'll take it. So your agenda has kind of two arts-related items, but I think if we take them one at a time, that'll probably be best. So let me make sure I share this screen. I think. Okay. Do you guys want the lights down? Okay. So as I said, there's a couple items on the agenda. So just a reminder of how they kind of all relate to each other. At your last Economic Development Committee meeting, you had reviewed and approved our designated endowment fund agreement with the Community Foundation, and so that kind of creates that framework and legal structure for the endowment for the Community Foundation to set it up for us. And then what we're going to look at today, agenda item 3, would be the governance and distribution policy for that endowment agreement. So that really digs into how the city will manage and oversee that endowment on our end and our processes. And then the second piece of that would be looking at the Arts Anchor Fund policy, and that's a funding program named in the endowment policy. So a lot of moving parts, but hopefully it'll make sense as we talk through it. So in your agenda packet for this item, there were kind of two things. There was the draft policy, and then you had also requested to see the historical returns of the Community Foundation Standard Fund versus what they call like their socially responsible fund. So we'll look at both of those, and I'll start with those investment returns first. So Midwest One Bank is one of the 4 local investors that the Community Foundation uses, and they created this environmental, social, and governmental fund, so I'll call it the ESG fund, that the Community Foundation offers to anyone who holds a fund with them. That summary from Midwest One was in your agenda packet. I think it starts on page 13. But this slide shows a comparison of returns on kind of just their standard endowment pool versus the ESG specific fund. So most, I think all but one of the funds they currently have are in that standard pool, and then I believe there's one church who's using that ESG. So this, as you can see, last year, ending December 31, the return of that ESG fund was 14% compared to the regular endowment pool of 15.65%. And then if you look at that average, even if you pull out that kind of off year in 2022, it's pretty comparable over the last 5 years. So what that looks like as an actual impact on our endowment fund, this kind of projects that out. And this is included in page 15 of your agenda packet. That last column highlighted in yellow shows kind of the difference in what the year-end funding balance would be if it was invested in the standard portfolio versus the ESG. So as you can see through these first 10 years, pretty negligible, not much of a difference. When you get beyond that first 10 years is when you start to see some of those differences compound. We do hope and intend for this endowment to be a long-term solution that'll outlast any of us. So kind of look beyond that. Year 20, you see a $4,000 difference, $9,000 by year 30, $50,000 by year 50. Just kind of goes from there.
Rachel, can you explain the difference between the numbers that you just cited, 15.65 versus 14% on the first chart, and then these seem to only have a 4 basis point difference between the two different funds, as opposed to 165 or 1.65% difference?
Ooh.
So if you go back 2 slides, the 15.65 versus 14, and these projections.
Oh, I used the average.
14 point.
I used the 5-year average excluding 2022, 14.93 and 14.89.
Oh, I see.
Sorry, that
No,
was
that is
really-
okay. I was looking at the big red box circled at the top.
Yeah,
Perfect.
but
Thank you.
I'd be happy to do any other comparables you want to see.
That is perfect. I appreciate that. I'm actually going to move my laptop out of the way so I do better.
Oh, no, it's okay. So, yeah, that's kind of the difference using that 5-year average. And these projections are based on our 6-year contribution schedule, those first 6 years. Of course, if there were any other additional contributions made, that could change the calculus even more. So right now, the policy that you had included in your agenda packet doesn't direct anything specific about the fund. So that means the community foundation would just invest it as they would any other fund they hold, absent any special direction. If there was a desire from you and the city council to direct a different approach to the investment, just a few things maybe to consider. As we've seen, there's a pretty minor difference in return over the last 5 years. Pretty minor difference in that short-term impact. Long-term, it starts to grow a little bit. The community foundation does like to pool all their funds because it provides benefits to all of those parties involved. They're kind of like rising tide raises all boats approach. They can diversify more. Some of the lower fee ratios, those are some of the benefits that they see from it. So those are just a few things to consider. So that kind of is the review of those returns. I'll move on to reviewing the policy unless you wanted to stop here and have any questions or...
As far as which fund we invest in, I think Councilor Wyline and I can talk through that right now. I have a feeling that the whole council is going to want to also have that conversation, so I'm not sure how you want to go forward with the two different options. I did spend a little bit of time just looking at what these two funds actually are, pulling up the prospectuses, and had a hard time differentiating between what the actual top 10 investments were between the ESG and the non-ESGs. I don't know how far you got into the weeds on that, but
Yeah.
I didn't feel like we were getting a lot for the difference, but maybe you had a different opinion.
No, I did not specifically look into. For one, it was kind of difficult to sparse for me,
Yeah.
and I guess maybe it might be. Well, I'm kind of thinking, two things about this is try to come up with some type of figuring out exactly what the difference is in terms of investment, what the potential red flags in the community might be with the standard fund and the what are we calling the
ESG.
ESG.
ESG. And sorry, the what are we calling the social justice fund or
Sorry, that was another name for the ESG. That's what we had been calling it at the last meeting. But
ESG,
the
okay.
ESG is Environmental, Social, and Governance Fund.
social and okay, sorry, I got my acronyms mixed up. Yeah, I think I also want to, because this was something that was brought up to me by people involved in arts organizations, I kind of feel weird being the one up here to just kind of like, or for us to unilaterally make the decision. I'm not sure what the communication approach would be or what mechanism it would be to get input from whomever, you know what I mean? Because I know what, my opinion would be, but again, I don't, without some type of input, I guess it's hard for me to know. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll just tell you how I processed this, and that was on page 13 in our packet. They have the Midwest One ESG mutual fund strategy, and then they list out what those, if you look under the equity tab, what all those funds are, and you can just kind of look and see what the investments are. And so you have to kind of go down 3 levels of the fund to see and that can at least give you a sense of like what those investments are. As far as what the arts organizations want us to do for investment, they are members of the community, so it matters what they think. I think, though, this is a fund for our whole community. So I don't know that the arts organizations having a different weighted voice in how we choose to invest is the way I would think about it.
Yeah.
Because it's us as a city council making choices about how we invest money that would theoretically represent our values, but also financially impact the city. So as far as community input, you're right. We should absolutely have it. As far as specifically inviting some arts organizations, I don't know that I'm thinking about it the same way that you are right
Yeah.
now.
And I guess I don't. Again, I don't know exactly what mechanism that would take, or because when it comes to arts organizations, there isn't some monolith, right?
Right. And it could be different ones in the future. And
could be different ones, and but again, there might be suggestions from folks involved in the process of how we could do that. So I guess I'm not entirely sure. Are you looking for direction today?
Not necessarily. At our last meeting, we had just talked about this and you wanted to see it, so I was able to get this from the
Okay.
Community Foundation. I will say for the Arts Anchor Fund policy, I did meet with all of the beneficiaries of that, the arts organizations, and we talked very briefly just that this was going to be included on the agenda too, a review of this. And so they were all invited to, they provided feedback on the policy as well as, if they had thoughts about this. I didn't hear anything specific about investment strategy from any of them, but I can do additional outreach if you prefer.
Okay.
I find this very helpful to have the ability to look and see what the differences between the funds are and to see the difference between what future funding models would look like, A versus B, to sort of see what there's a financial difference to see that. So I appreciate you doing the effort. It sounds like that's maybe the end of the conversation for right now.
For sure, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So the second part, I guess, is we're ready to move on to that.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you.
So that would be kind of a review of that governance and distribution policy for the endowment. So that starts on page 9 of your agenda packet, and I'll just kind of walk through the sections at a high level. Hopefully you had a chance to review that yourself. So let me see. Just a reminder, the purpose is this would be attached to our fund agreement with the Community Foundation to kind of give us a sense of how we will oversee and implement the fund on our end. Reminder that the endowment purpose statement that you approved at your last EDC meeting was to support arts and cultural initiatives taking place within the corporate limits of Iowa City, including but not limited to grants to nonprofit organizations, artists, and programs that advance community access to the arts. So section 2 describes the different governance roles and structures, and I think this will feel very familiar to you as to how we have traditionally approved kind of arts funding. So the full city council will have final approval over that agreement policy, and then annual contributions to the fund and eventually annual distributions from the fund. EDC would be kind of the first stop for all those actions, so you'll review the staff recommendation and forward it on to council. Staff will prepare recommendations for the council. They'll also do all the administrative activities required, oversight, compliance, monitoring, all that kind of stuff. And then the city manager is designated as the authorized representative. The fund agreement requires we have an authorized representative, so the city manager could sign off on those final distribution requests after council approves it. And then the Community Foundation would be the one to actually hold and invest the endowment fund for their policies, our policy, and then the distribution recommendation that you make each year. So section 3 kind of lays out our planned contribution schedule and then what I'm calling kind of the triggers for accessing the fund in different ways. So the contributions, we anticipate about a $1.8 million investment over those first 6 years, starting in FY27. We project that investment at around fiscal year 30 will reach what we call the minimum fund balance, and that's set at $2 million. We set that amount based on, we want to make sure we have enough principal to accomplish the goals we want with this fund. So we would not be able to draw from the endowment until it hits 2 million. If for any reason it dropped below 2 million during the life of the fund, again, we wouldn't be able to draw from it.
I have a question about that.
Yes.
Do you want me to wait to the end or right now?
Go ahead.
Because I am curious. I noticed that as item 3.3 minimum fund balance, and what you're saying. I'm curious about whether these are internal controls and best practices, or these are actually legal obligations for the city council. Specifically, if we drop below $2 million, some future city council, could they say, we disregard this guidance from this document, we would choose to withdraw all of our money or more than the amount currently recommended here, which is $2 million. I don't know the mechanism of what we can do or future councils can do versus what is completely out of our hands. And I see benefits to both ways,
Yeah.
right? Like having some controls is good, but also not having control is a little concerning.
Yeah.
You know?
I will let Eric also answer, but I believe since this would be attached to the fund agreement, it's also directing the community foundation how they should manage the funds as well. So we're providing this direction to them, but.
Right, but if, Councilor Moe, if you're asking about whether this endowment for the arts governance and distribution policy approved by the council can be changed by a future council, I think the answer is yes.
And the future council would have the opportunity to eliminate the fund and cash out.
Well, when you say cash out, I think the nature of the endowment fund under state law is that you
Okay.
cannot cash out.
Yeah, that's the thing I want to test is like, what is, if we're unhappy with this, what are the mechanisms to get out? Not that I want to, I'm very excited
Yeah,
about this,
no, I
but I
understand.
want to understand what kind of mechanism it would take to undo.
Yeah, I would have to look into that. I mean, my recollection of when this state law came into existence, probably 22 or 23 years ago, was the very nature of the permanence of an endowment fund. There is state law that governs kind of what happens to a nonprofit, which is somewhat different, but I'd be happy to look into kind of whether there are any escape clauses. I kind of suspect not, or that they'd be limited, but I can check.
Yeah, and I'm not taking a position, I'm just kind of
Yeah, I
curious.
understand.
if
Just
what-
hypothetically.
What if what if things change? So, and I like the idea of having a permanent arts fund, so I can just say that very publicly and having sort of certainty. But I kind of like the idea of it being maybe not easily changed by a future council, but maybe that's something.
So it's the way that the agreement's written with the CFJC is it's pretty flexible in that, if a future council wanted to shift away from funding the nonprofit arts organizations, I think public art in general is encapsulated in that. It talks about being able to make payments to artists. So those dollars, I think a future council could shift the purpose of those dollars within that stated umbrella. Not that that's our intention, but instead of cashing out, you could redirect the use of those funds under that public art umbrella.
With the understanding there would always be $2 million in the fund and the council would not have the ability to change that.
Well, I think part of it is how much has council contributed to the corpus, to the principal. Normally, when you have an endowment fund, there's flexibility as to the interest that has been earned on the endowment corpus, but that you can't mess with the corpus. And so my question would be, how do we get the $2 million? Was that through, 1.8 million worth of contributions and then, accumulated interest in the meantime as we're working up to 2 million, or did we contribute 2 million? And I think the answer would differ depending on the answer to that question.
Okay. Thanks.
Good questions. Anything else? Okay. So like I was saying, our model projected that we would start drawdown in about fiscal year 33. We used a really conservative 7% return rate on that model, but as you saw, the actual returns have historically been almost double of that, or have been double of that. So it's possible we could achieve that 2 million balance early, but our intent would still to wait to draw until we're done contributing for those first 6 years. Whoops. And then the annual spending draw rate, this is the percentage of the annual distributions of the fund balance that you can withdraw. So we modeled off a 4% spending rate, which is what the policy includes. The CFG, the Community Foundation's cap is 1% higher. Their cap is 5%. We used 4% because that's what allowed us to balance kind of that competing priority of growing the fund, but also accessing the funds kind of as soon as feasible, making sure we're getting them out, kind of balancing, that long-term investment and also getting it back out into the community and shifting reliance off the general fund. Okay. Section 4 is the distribution categories. So that is what's defining eligible uses of the endowment. So it's just clear both to the current council and then long in the future what the intent of the fund is, at least at the time of creation. So the three kind of categories that have been laid out is what we call the Arts Anchor Fund. So that's what kind of that annual funding support for the Englert Film Scene, Riverside Summer of the Arts, City of Literature, and then adding in Public Space 1. As I said, we'll talk about that policy next. We have included Arts Alliance support for some administrative support for that initiative, and then we have kind of a flexible other category for other public art, project-based grants, capital project support opportunities, that kind of thing. Annual process. This matches up with that Arts Anchor Fund policy you'll look at next. It should look very familiar to you. It's kind of what we've been doing, just formalizes that. So in the summer and the fall, staff will work with the arts organizations. We'll also review fund performance with the Community Foundation, prepare that recommendation for either contribution and or distribution each year. That'll come to the EDC to review. They will forward a recommendation on to City Council. And then City Council will have to take two actions. One, they approve those amounts through the annual budget process. And then two, they'll adopt a separate resolution that requests distributions from the Community Foundation. And then that resolution is what we will submit to the Community Foundation to actually have the funds paid back out. And then just the final section of the policy is review and amendment. Because it's going to go through EDC and council each year, I think each year we can just take a quick look, make sure that nothing in the policy needs updating. If it does, it would have to go back through City Council to, by resolution, be amended. So that's kind of that first policy. Happy to answer questions, go back.
Going to move on to talk about the anchor.
It's up to you. What do you prefer?
I am interested to learn more about how, again, the mechanism for changing those organizations, if necessary,
Sure.
and maybe a little bit of information about where the Arts Alliance concept is if that has a play in all of this too, because I understood that was a separate moving part that could
Yes.
become the anchor organization.
Yeah. So those three distribution categories. So like I said, this is going to be the policy that's attached to the fund agreement. We'll have a separate policy about the Arts Anchor Fund. Arts Alliance support and other distribution categories would, I don't think they necessitate a full policy, but they would, of course, have like a funding agreement or something like that with the recipient. So that would probably come a little bit later.
Okay.
But where that is at is the Downtown District has posted a director position to get that up and running, and it's still underway. They haven't started interviewing.
I saw that position was posted, so
Yeah.
I was going to ask about that as well.
Yes.
So when it comes to the current, like you said, the current status of the Arts Alliance, it's not, up and running yet.
Right.
Is there kind of like we need to wait to hire a director and this can take time. I was just curious if there was maybe the Arts Alliance will be up and running at this time or something like that.
I think their hope for hiring is by the end of the summer sometime.
Okay.
So they should have that position filled and then would start implementing it. There's kind of been arts groups that have been meeting that composed of the Cultural and Entertainment District and then the steering committee for this Arts Alliance feasibility study. So it's like a big group of
Yeah.
Iowa City kind of art stakeholders, and they've still been meeting annual or monthly just to keep it front of mind and keep things moving forward and start talking about what kind of things do we want to see in year one out of this Arts Alliance. But yeah, once they get that director on board, then I think they can start doing the strategic plan and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Also, the reason I ask is because, I mean, naturally, when I think about, the discussion about the investment, which investment pool to go into, I think when I think of an organization that, could have some type of, not the end say, but they could talk about it and then give their opinion to council, I don't know if that is something that they're even wanting to talk about, or I don't necessarily want to be like, you have to direct the Arts Alliance to give us an opinion, but maybe just communicate that the council is deliberating or has been talking about this, and maybe you would like some feedback, if that's cool.
Sure, yeah. I can do it.
Make sure to put "if that's cool" in there. Yeah.
I want to go back to the Arts Anchor Fund and who those listed organizations are. Is that the next slides?
Well, we will go through it, yes.
Okay,
but
that's I'm really
Okay.
curious about that.
Okay,
so I'm
sure.
Sorry, to jump ahead.
Yeah, no problem. I just wanted to kind of explain because you were asking about those different
Yeah,
funding
yeah.
programs. So since this one is a little more complex, we felt it warranted a kind of a separate policy specifically for that. So I will go through that. Like I said, it's kind of the Arts Anchor Fund is the primary funding program of the endowment, and what we really see it as kind of like a formalization of some of that funding support we already provide to those groups. Just a reminder of kind of why we went down this route. As you probably know, the last few years, the arts organizations have submitted their letters for requesting annual support. They've continued to communicate increased need as their own costs increase, their free and public access programming expands, and other factors. We have, because of broader city budget challenges, had to keep their funding at status quo for the last few years. Also, at that time, different arts organizations have inquired about the disparity between funding, just kind of an inconsistent, unclear process for their funding, and so we wanted to address that as well. So our purpose really is to hopefully provide stable, predictable, measurable, equitable funding to these arts organizations over the long term. Why those six? Those six have really been, they not only have historically, aside from PS1, benefited from our funding, but they're also largely at the kind of center of lots of these collaborative efforts that we see. The Arts Alliance is a great example of that. And then they all kind of fit that anchor category that we have dubbed it. They have a really clear, measurable economic impact on our community through their different arts programming. So the draft was based on balancing these different goals. We also looked at some other examples. Some of the arts organizations pointed us to Bravo Des Moines as the regional arts council in that region, and they do an annual operating support program, so we drew from some of their practices. And then we, of course, had feedback from the arts organizations over the last few years. They've provided those conversations, and then we also met recently to go over this policy as well and get any specific feedback they had, and some of that was incorporated too. So section B is the eligibility, and that's where it names those eligible organizations. So we kind of split it out into two tiers, which I'll talk a little bit about. So the public access tiers are City of Literature and Summer of the Arts, and then the revenue generating tiers are the Englert Film Scene, Riverside Theater, and Public Space 1. We name these organizations in the policy, so if any organizations were to be added, it would require amendment of the policy. We do lay out what we define as eligibility criteria, which is that they're a nonprofit or sponsored by one, headquartered and primarily operating within Iowa City. They have an arts-focused mission, at least a 10-year track record, and then they're operating, again, at that scale consistent with what we consider institutional or anchor type of organization. A quick note on the funding tiers. The tier 1 groups are incorrect in your original agenda packet. So these are going to be the revised ranges, which I'll include in the minutes. But we broke it out into 2 funding tiers. So the key difference is that tier 1 are considered those public access anchors. They provide mostly free programming, which means they have low to no opportunity for earned revenue generation, but a really high public benefit, right? It's completely open access. And then the tier 2 are the earned revenue anchors. They have a little more diversified funding model, so they do have more potential to earn revenue through ticket sales, rentals, memberships, that kind of thing. And while, of course, we know many of them do offer free programming, they also rely on paid programming for a significant portion of what they do. Within each tier, they're further broken down by their budget size. This is to recognize that as you're a smaller organization, you might need a slightly more a larger proportional investment to achieve more meaningful level of support. And then as you grow and mature, you kind of have more capacity, can access more revenue sources, and generally can become less reliant on our public funding support. So these funding ranges themselves, they were modeled based on, again, some of those other examples we looked at, and then feedback from the groups themselves of kind of like where they're at, wanting to balance that equity and parity as we look to reallocate the funds. So what that looks like is this would be an example of where we estimate those FY28 estimated funding levels to fall based on their current budget size and the tier that they fall in. Our intent is that these ranges would provide, exactly that, a range for that annual allocation. It could change from year to year based on need or current conditions, that kind of thing, but this at least gives the arts organizations an idea and an ability to plan ahead, which is something they haven't had so far. As you can see, if you look at the bottom of the total in that range column, we have $315,000 available in FY28, so we wouldn't be able to fund everyone at their maximum level. But we talked this over with the arts groups; they all understand and would like to just try to maintain huge fluctuations in their funding levels as we kind of reallocate. I will point out that currently we're doing about $250,000 in annual funding, so that will be increasing to $315,000. So overall, the pot is increasing. We do add Public Space 1, and then, as you'll recall, through your FY27 budget, you approved their annual funding awards, which is this last column here, and then you also approved a 10% across the board increase for all of them in the fall as we get some lost revenue in, and that was intentional. Our hope was that that additional funding could help those organizations just kind of plan ahead, knowing that in FY28 their funding could shift a little, and so just to provide them a nice little extra infusion of support. Then moving on to Section D, which is the allocation process and methodology. Again, it's very similar to our current process and what I talked about before. In the kind of late summer, early fall, they'll submit all their required reporting documents to me. Staff will prepare that recommendation for the council EDC to review. That gets forwarded on through the city council to approve through the budget process. Once that's approved, then we would start executing funding agreements with each organization. We don't currently do that, so we would start executing funding agreements that define kind of the deliverables that they will provide and how our funding could be used, and then we will issue the payment. In meeting with the arts groups, they do really value that annual presentation to the Economic Development Committee, and they wanted to keep that in, so we definitely want to invite them back. The kind of criteria that funding awards will be based on, of course, it'll be based on what we have available overall for that funding pot. Then it would be based on their ranges for each, and furthermore, kind of the criteria listed here, which would be community impact, collaboration, and contribution, public access and equity, financial status and stability, and then economic impact. So again, I would say this is pretty similar now to what many of them are reporting on annually, but it just keeps it consistent across the board and clear for them all.
So they're reporting back on how they spent the money. Are they also every year applying, saying this is what we're going to use the money for? Is that the application process to the community foundation, and ultimately they make a recommendation that council would review and approve? Am I understanding that process correctly?
I think this would be our opportunity to set it up however we want. How we had intended for the distributions from the community foundation to work would be, we would actually submit the distribution recommendation and they would pay it out to us, and then we would pay out the funds. They do have the ability to pay organizations directly if that's what you prefer. My understanding from previous conversations was we wanted to.
This is not a distribution of funds question. It's a little higher up the chain, and that's selection of actual funding. And like, are each year we requiring each organization to, these anchor organizations to apply for the funding? Or are we just, because you were talking about a sort of feedback process where they tell us how they've done in community access. Is it a two-part step where they actually apply for the funds and say, we will provide community access?
I would say it's kind of a version of an application. Let's see, in this policy, it lays out what they would submit each year. So their prior year operating budget, financial review, an annual report, kind of a narrative explanation of, anything new, different that they're doing, kind of those economic development indicators they've done, like tourism, benefits, jobs, that kind of thing. And then an expense report showing how they used our funds the previous period. So that would kind of be what their application, if that's what you want to call it, would be. Our policy doesn't allow them to ask for a specific amount.
Okay.
So
Nor
it's just,
say what they're going to do with the future year allocation.
yeah, that would be included, I think,
Okay.
in this document.
I guess I'll make up a hypothetical here. Like, we just got, Shakespeare was a huge success this year. Everybody loved Shakespeare in the Park. If one year Riverside is like, you know what, we don't want to do this anymore. Not that they would do that. It's so important to them. But like, what would the city council mechanism be to say, no, you're getting public funds. It's really important to us. You do Shakespeare in the Park for free for our community. Is it just wait for the next year? Is that the sort of mechanism? I'm curious if we should be treating this more like this is what we expect, and then have them say yes. And by the way, everything they're doing is good, and I wouldn't.
Anything we want to guarantee, we would probably want to include in their fund agreement.
Yeah, excuse me. Yes, I would agree. And of course, that also addresses the state constitutional issue that the auditor has been raising about, giving public funds to private entities and so forth. And so we'd want to, as Rachel suggested, have something like, we're going to give you these funds and this is what we're going to get in return. So if we want Shakespeare in the Park and that's got to be deliverable, we just write it right into the agreement.
Okay. Yeah, I would prefer that mechanism where we are explicit about that, and that's, to me, built off of things they're currently doing. Like, it's just, you are doing this, we love this, and we want to continue to fund it. So that's just if you have thoughts on that, as far as treating these a little bit more like contracts than grants in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I totally understand that. I also like the idea of the arts organizations having autonomy to do new things.
Sure.
You know what I mean? If they decide, we've been doing this for a long time, but here's this cool new thing, I don't necessarily want to have it be written in the contract agreement. It's like, well, no, you have to do this, but yeah, I don't know. I'd have to ponder on it.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting, I guess, that they couldn't change the offerings that they give to the community. I'm just saying it would have to be something that council would say, yes, this alternative is even better, and we like that also.
Yeah.
But have an opportunity to weigh in. So if public funds are going to a private not-for-profit, we make sure there's a public good coming out the other end. So that's just how I process it.
Yeah, I understand.
I can clarify in this, it is mostly backward looking, so I can clarify we also want to see a little bit of narrative of what they would hope to use the funding for.
I think that's a good idea.
Okay. Okay. Well, we skipped ahead a slide, so we kind of already talked about what we would want to see out of that annual submission, which would be their budget and financials, kind of metrics, narrative summary, annual report, that kind of thing, and then the expense report, and then we would include also forward-looking plans for any funding they received. And then, like the other policy, this would be adopted by a council resolution and would also require a council resolution to amend it. That's kind of the final review of that policy. Happy to answer questions. We can talk about either or both. Or...
I interrupted you plenty during the presentation, so I got my
That's
questions
great.
out.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for getting all that information together about the funds. And it's extremely helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate the process here where we're getting walked through what this looks like. And
So our next steps would be if you want to vote to forward these on as recommendations to the full city council, then later this summer, we would probably bring all three to city council for review and approval. So it would be the fund agreement that you approved last time with this governance and distribution policy attached, and then the arts anchor fund separately.
Okay.
should I move for that?
Yeah.
I would move that we forward this on as presented with the adjustments for future looking activities to the full council.
Yeah.
And I don't know that we need to state which date.
Second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Obviously no.
That was for agenda item 4.
Sorry, yes. The Arts Anchor Fund methodology and policy. Would you like me to have a new?
Well, just thinking, I was thinking it was maybe for 3 and 4, but.
Oh, it can be. Okay.
Well, I mean, let's clarify intent of council members.
Yeah, so when I made my motion, my poorly formed motion, it was based on the entire presentation, which includes items 3 and 4.
Okay.
Excellent.
So if you would like to revote on that, I'm happy to do that.
That's fine.
Okay, all right. All right, so we move on to 5, the proposed residential tax incentive program update.
Okay, I'm going to handle this. Nora Cahill in our office has done the heavy lifting on this item. She is out of the office right now, so I'm going to pinch hit and do my best to give you the update here. Let's go ahead and just kind of recap what we talked about in April. So the feat we presented you, just kind of the background on why a tax exemption program may be of interest for the city. We talked about the supply that we need, and we kind of gave you some rough sketches of what that may look like. And the consensus from the EDC was that there was continued interest to explore a tax exemption program for multifamily housing. There was also the suggestion that we consider a enhanced exemption schedule for any developments that include affordable housing. And then you asked us to consult some regional developers to get their feedback and affordable housing providers. So real quick, we'll revisit the kind of the why behind this. We know that your strategic plan is calling for more residential development and specifically development that shapes a comfortable human scale pedestrian environment. So really talking about some of the smaller multifamily that's more contextual with neighborhoods. We know, although the comprehensive plan is still in development, we know what the production goal is, and that comes out to about 364 units needed per year to get to our 2050 goal there. And then we can look at building statistics and see how we're doing. And pre-COVID, we were doing pretty well with meeting some of those numbers, but really from 2020 to 2025 on the multifamily side, we've seen a drop in units added per year or permitted per year. And those that we have added in those last 5 years have primarily been student or senior oriented. So we're not hitting that general market category. Okay, we'll go on to the next slide. I wanted just to reiterate, we spent a lot of time on this at the last meeting, that tax exemption's just one tool, right? It's not the silver bullet. It's not going to be everything that we need to do for affordable housing. But as you know, the city has various programs and policies in place to work at along the entire spectrum of affordability when it comes to housing. So this was just some of the examples of types of programs and policies the city does to work along the very low income, and middle income parts of that spectrum. Tax exemption is on that kind of more on that low to middle income side. It's really intended for that market rate housing, but can play a role in the development of low income housing too. Specifically, could be utilized by LIHTC developers and other private providers of affordable housing. Okay, we did get together with a handful of developers that have experience not only in Iowa City, but throughout the state of Iowa, in some cases outside of the state of Iowa, and got some helpful feedback from them. Like you would expect, kind of like we experience with many things, the feedback wasn't all in sync. Different developers had different perspectives, so we've kind of tried to tease out where there was some consensus. Some helpful comments they provided, including just how, from a length of time standpoint, to really sync the exemption schedule with standard kind of refinancing practices. So greater than 5 years or 10 years seem to be the consensus, and maybe to avoid some of the shorter, like 2 or 3 year types of exemption schedules. We had drafted a cap of 50 units, again, really not wanting to over-incentivize really large developments that tend to be, in our recent history, tend to be either large senior housing, large student housing. So we had suggested a cap of 50, and they asked us to consider a higher number at 65, which aligns with the Workforce Housing Tax Credit Program at the state.
That was driving that number, is that
Yes.
tax credit?
Correct. And then there was a lot of discussion about the kind of trying to keep it simple, and then a little bit contradicting that. There was keep it simple, but maybe provide us options too. So maybe a couple different exemption schedules that we could choose from, which isn't unusual. Cities can and do that. But they specifically asked us to look at some other cities that do this and think about aligning it with those communities. So they gave us some suggestions to research and to look into. But to the extent that we can align it with existing programs in other cities, they would like that. And to the extent they could have maybe a choice on a different path to take, might work. You may recall we had some scenarios sketched out for you to describe how much tax exemption may be provided. They were pretty clear in saying what we had sketched out really wouldn't move the needle for them in terms of getting a development that was kind of on the fence to go forward. So they encouraged us again to look at the other cities that are doing this and increase either the percentage of exemption or the amount of years in that exemption period. And then we had a discussion. One of the developers in the room tends to build multifamily but sells the units as individual.
I want to step back one
Yeah.
sentence.
Sure.
The idea that the as sketched out proposal was not consistent with what our neighboring communities are doing.
Yeah.
First of all, did you check on that? I know that sometimes there's a sentiment versus a reality that aren't always in alignment.
Yeah.
With development.
No, I think it's fair characterization that what we had presented was on the low end of compared to other cities that do it. Not all cities provide exemption, so many are like us that don't provide a residential exemption. But they pointed us to Cedar Rapids, Cedar Falls, I think Davenport, maybe as some examples to look at, and they're definitely more generous there.
Okay, thanks.
And then the last point was from a developer that tends to create condo units and sell those individually. And If the goal is to jumpstart development, those exemptions would really be passed along to the buyers at the end of the day. So it may not have the intended effect of subsidizing the developer to start a project. So they talked about maybe different ways to do that. So it's not based on the taxes paid. So for example, could be cash up front to them upon completion of a building, or could be down payment assistance for the buyers. And a program like that would be down payment assistance specifically for the buyers, could give them more confidence in selling their units and help them make that go, no-go decision. So that was helpful feedback as well. That was April, and then May came along, and May delivered property tax reform. So property tax reform threw a wrench into this, and I'll give you a brief overview of why it's a little bit more complicated now as we sit here on July 1st. So the Senate File 2472, which is the property tax reform law now, creates a 2% cap on the general fund levy, excluding new construction, qualifying improvements, and boundary adjustments. So basically what that means is as properties are reassessed, year over year, cities are limited to capturing 2% of that. So let's say in the past, we've seen Iowa City have a really strong housing market and housing reevaluations throughout the city in a given year could have gone up 5 or 10%. Well, if that's the case, then we're only going to be able to capture 2% of that going forward. All right. That doesn't mean people are paying lower taxes, or they're not paying taxes. They're still, what's happening is we're capped at 2%, and the way they do that is they force us to drop our property tax rate. All right. So but we get new construction on top of that. So that's our incentive to continue to grow. We know that 2% isn't going to pay the bills for our municipal operations. So we really need to get new construction that will take that number up to 3 or 4% to really maintain those status quo operations. Unfortunately, growth resulting from projects under tax exemptions and tax increment financing are not included as new construction. So there's kind of this conflict between the tools that we have to incentivize development and then that development not counting as new construction and therefore not contributing to the provision of public services. So the logic behind this is if I'm incentivizing building A through tax exemption, those taxes aren't paid when that property is built, therefore it's not new construction. Those taxes eventually get paid as that tax exemption or TIF starts to phase out, but that's in a future year. And cities, we tried to make the argument as this law was being drafted to say, well, in those future years when those taxes start getting paid back to the taxing bodies, that should count as new construction down the line. And then we knew we would get that eventually. Unfortunately, they didn't go with that argument, and now we have a situation in which those programs could incentivize growth, but then not provide the dollars needed to support the public services that would accommodate that growth. So one of the historically helpful things about tax exemption or tax abatement programs is that they apply broadly, they're simple, they're not like TIF deals where they're individually negotiated and can take months to develop. If you qualify, you can access them. And by that nature, you're watering down that but-for test, right? Because some properties that would go forward are going to take advantage of this exemption, even though they didn't really need it to make that go, no-go decision. But as a whole, you were thinking, well, we're getting more started, and if we over-incentivize a little bit, it's okay, because we're going to jumpstart a bunch of ones that wouldn't have gone forward. Well, we got to be careful with that now, especially when we're thinking as broadly as all multifamily in the city. Multifamily properties do require public services, and we're going to have to be a little bit careful on over incentivizing those and not having them support our public services. So if you, particularly if you look at media in central Iowa, a lot of communities use tax abatement, tax exemption programs in the Des Moines metro area. I've listed some here that have either said they're pausing those programs or that they're doing internal reviews, and there's been a lot of focus on that for this very reason.
And those pauses are based on Senate File 2479, not what we know. Okay.
Correct.
So this has all happened in the last month.
It's all within the last month or two, yes. So we've kind of slow played coming back to you. Our original intention was to have another public outreach with affordable housing developers and then come back to you with a revised schedule or proposal. We're just not quite there yet. I think we need to pause this ourselves. We are starting to look at some hybrid models. So are there ways to still offer this program but allow taxes to come on? So whether that means not really providing, maybe providing a delayed benefit, so where they're not getting that tax abatement benefit in year 1 or 2, but it's coming down the road. Could something like that work? Is there a different type of incentive tool that better aligns with the property tax reform bill? We're looking at all those things. We're also hearing that there could be a legislative fix to this, that as these other cities are pausing programs and developers are not able to access those funds and not able to get their housing projects out of the ground, that the lawmakers next session may consider a definitional change here to kind of restore the utility of these incentive programs. We're going to have to kind of contemplate whether we want to wait for that opportunity to come next year or not. So we're going to continue to still work through some hybrid models. We're talking with other cities to understand their thought process. And we'll talk to some of our municipal advisors as well that can give us some ideas. That's a long way of saying that we're continuing to work on this. It is a little bit on the back burner at this time, and we'll probably come back to you in the fall or winter with either a proposal on how we think we can go move forward and mitigate some of those property tax concerns, or come back and tell you that we'd like to put it on hold and see if the legislature is going to pursue a fix.
So our city, I'm not so concerned about our TIF policy because those are all discretionary at the council level and we wouldn't be sort of taken advantage of, I guess, because we'd have a final say. But how many tax abatement districts do we still have in Iowa City? And is that something that we should be revisiting as far as pausing them until the law gets fixed if these other communities are doing that?
Yeah, we have a longstanding industrial tax abatement program. And then we have a highway, Highway 1, Highway 6 commercial tax abatement program. We have not, Rachel and I have discussed this. I don't think we have the utilization of either of those that would cause us to pause the programs. It's something that we need to look at, but if there was much heavier utilization of those programs, I would think so. I tend to think that their utilization rates are such that we don't need to take the action to stop them right now.
Okay.
I was curious. I had a question about some of the developer feedback. Even though it sounds like this might be still in the works and on the back burner, so it might not be as urgent, but I just wanted clarification on what exactly they were suggesting with the condominium cash payout, like what they were envisioning that would look like.
So the goal is to get a developer to decide to build a building that they otherwise wouldn't because the financials aren't there, right? So when you have a tax abatement program, that's benefiting the owner of the building years 1 through however many you set the program, we'll say 1 through 5 after it's built. So when you build a regular apartment building and you own it, you're paying taxes on it, and that abatement program helps you directly. So it helps your pro forma. It may help you to start a project that you otherwise wouldn't. If you condo and sell those as a builder, you're no longer the owner in year 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So that property tax incentive doesn't really help your pro forma, right? It's still going to cost you the same to build it. And you still feel like the market to sell is the market to sell. So what they were saying is that exemption program is not going to incentivize me to build a condo unit, right? If I can't build it, it's not going to work. It's not going to get built. But what they said could help is to say, now, if you incentivized either a cash payment to us at completion, so if we said instead of a tax exemption program that may give you $50,000 for your 10 units that you built, why don't you just give us $50,000 in cash, and we can use that cash to pay off our debt that we use to build the building. Or they said, maybe create a down payment program that would facilitate sales, because it's hard to market a unit. Like, come buy my condo unit, you get a 5-year tax exemption. That's not a very kind of sexy marketing slogan, right? It's not going to draw people to buy a house. But if I said I've got a condo here for sale, it's $200,000, and I have $10,000 per unit in down payment assistance from the city, that may help somebody, right? It may help them secure that bank financing to buy that unit. So the developer said that actually could change our outlook on build, no build, because we feel like we'll feel a lot more confident that we can sell those units if we can market a down payment program that the city's funding. So it's just kind of trying to shift the mindset away from property tax incentives being meaningful for them to, let's get that money up front and either use it as down payment assistance or use it as incentive for us to pay down our costs.
Okay.
Make sense?
It does make sense. Yeah, I guess. So they're envisioning something where a down payment assistance program for them, not just the down payment assistance programs that we have at the city currently.
Yeah, so what we have currently in the city is kind of citywide. If you are eligible and you have found a unit, we'll work with you. This one would be this property at 123 Main Street is, all the units within it are eligible for down payment assistance.
Okay. I see.
Where are examples of down payment assistance? What cities in Iowa have that?
I'm not sure on that. There was one of the tax abatement programs, I believe it was Cedar Falls or Waterloo, that had a hybrid in which they provided cash payments in year 1 and then exemptions in those out years. So we're looking at that. But specific to down payment assistance, I would venture to guess there's multiple cities that have some sort of down payment assistance, probably not as common as a tax abatement program, but particularly those cities that get CDBG dollars or home dollars may
And
have that.
those down payment assistance, like you described for 123 Main Street, the council could theoretically have a say in, yes, we're willing to provide down payment assistance for this building because it meets certain needs.
Correct.
We're not going to give down payment assistance for high-end luxury housing or something.
Yeah, you could do that on a case by case basis.
Yeah.
too.
So you'd have some control over what that developer is providing. It's
Right.
not just,
It starts to move away from the tax exemption abatement model, which is standard. You meet the criteria, you get it. We could create basically a local program to say we're going to do down payment completely separate
if
from.
you meet this.
Correct.
This certain kinds of
Correct.
cost metrics or, okay.
Correct. That just does not help the average apartment building that is leasing instead of selling.
Right. And it could be tethered to something like a workforce housing tax credit where like anyone who qualifies for that, and then you can sort of double a means tested so that the right the people at the most need would get targeted.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You say that you've heard talk of concepts of plans for a legislative fix. Do you mean from like legislators, just things you've heard from other cities in their conversations?
So the legislative fix, so to speak, was debated between the House and the Senate and the governor's office. And if recollection serves me correct, the Senate bill actually incorporated the what the cities wanted in terms of protecting these incentive programs. However, the compromise at the end of the day, that definition fell off, right? And so what we're hearing, and this comes from the Iowa League of Cities, it comes from some of the kind of development professionals, organizations, is that they're hearing a willingness to reconsider that going forward, right? We've heard a number of people say any complicated bill like this is probably going to need some tweaks, right? That's a common refrain that we've heard, and we just don't know if this definitional one would be acceptable. It was in the Senate, if I'm recalling that correctly, but we just didn't get the House and the governor on board. And clearly there'll be someone new in the governor's office, so that could change.
Yeah.
I wouldn't bank on it.
Okay.
You know, we've heard legislative fixes to things like the library levy before. That has never happened. But I wouldn't want to if we do feel that's a real possibility, I wouldn't necessarily want to create a substandard incentive just to kind of work around this thing only a couple months later for them to fix it and us to scrap and start back over.
Yeah, and I mean, a library levy versus a tax incentive to build, market rate housing, you would think that one would be more in line with the Republican legislator. So maybe this has something with more legs where, they are opposed to libraries existing and versus they want. That's how I'm thinking. I was also thinking when it comes to strategy, if there's a way that the city can add a voice to like, hey, this is actually screwing over things you like, like strategies that you would prefer we use to, I'm not sure, but yeah.
Yeah, I would think that this is likely to be a top priority for the League of Cities, and we've generally promoted their top priorities.
Okay.
It could be a legislative priority for us, and we could ask our delegation to really try to carry that forward. I don't think they would be moving alone in that effort. I think a lot of lawmakers are going to be hearing from cities about this, particularly in central Iowa, in which this tool is much more frequently used than other parts of the state.
Mm-hmm. I'm good.
I just say I don't have any more questions, and I don't think there's an action item for us. on
Correct.
this, so
We'll circle back in the
appreciate-
fall or the winter.
I appreciate the follow-up. I'm sorry the change in legislation changed the direction of the conversation so much. I think we're on to agenda item 6, staff updates. Nothing. Rachel?
I don't have anything.
Jeff? Eric? No? New business? I have none.
I have none.
All right. Would you like to move to adjourn?
Yeah, so moved.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.